Welcome to a series of conversations aimed at commemorating the 20th anniversary of UMAC, the International Committee of University Museums and Collections of the International Council of Museums, ICOM. And today we have a very special guest, a very distinguished guest, and one of my all-time inspiring museum professionals and scholars, who was at the heart of UMAC's creation in more than one way, as we will see. So I have the pleasure and honor to introduce you to Bernice Murphy, who is logging in from Sydney, Australia, and who was Vice-President of ICOM between 1995 and 2004, right when UMAC was created. Being from Australia, where she was National Director of Museums Australia, and created what became Australia's first Museum of Contemporary Art, the MCA Australia in Sydney, I'm hoping that we can also begin exploring together the significant contribution of Australia to the global university museums movement since the late 1990s. So thank you so much, Bernice, for accepting our invitation, UMAC's invitation, to be with us. And before we dig into university museums, specifically UMAC, ICOM, I would like to ask you, how and when did you become interested in museums? Why did you become a museum professional? And perhaps use this question as an opportunity to introduce yourself to our audience.
Thank you, Marta. Well, it was very circumstantial, and I hope I don't disappoint people by giving a perhaps unexpected answer. I was not preparing in any way to work in museums when I was first drawn to the possibility of moving interstate. And in fact, an application was successful. And my first experience from the inside with museums was when I was appointed to head education in the Art Gallery of New South Wales, the State Museum in Sydney. So I found myself in a very established institution, and I emphasized the first colony in Australia. So the whole process of colonialism begins through Sydney. And I was there at a very interesting time, and I found wonderful colleagues to work with. And a whole animated engagement with the world of museums really began then. Even so, I moved away. After 3 years, I moved into the world of exhibition organization internationally. And then I came back to the Art Gallery of New South Wales when it first, in the whole country, developed a position of curator of contemporary art. So I was back in the State Gallery where I had been before, but focused on contemporary art as a new field then, as a standalone orientation. But in the process, I became drawn out into much wider questions of colonialism, Indigenous history, what had happened to Indigenous people. So this affected my orientation as a contemporary art curator, but then it gradually also drew me into wider historical reflections on the role of museums worldwide.
Wow. So, and today, what are you doing now presently? How is your day? You're editor?
Well, I have done a lot of things in my life in reverse to the usual procedure. So after many years serving ICOM from 1995, when I was first of all an ordinary council member, and then later in 98 became vice president. I then, when I finished those 6 years or 9 years on council, a new council asked me would I chair the ethics committee, which opened up another 7 years of work. So after this long period of always being drawn back into ICOM at times when I thought I had finished a phase and was about to withdraw. In 2016, after I had completed a volume again for ICOM for its anniversary, the 70th anniversary, and the ethics book, which was launched in Milan. That had taken me about a year and a half, very solid work. I finally decided I needed to fulfill a promise I had made years before to colleagues at the Australian National University that I would do my doctorate, a doctoral dissertation on museums. So rather in the reverse order to the way people normally plan a career, I felt bound to honor this trust. And really it has been a reflection on museums, but particularly inside Australia and the whole colonial process.
That's good.
So
Fantastic.
I have finished now.
You have finished. Also, congratulations, Dr. Bernice Murphy. And
Not quite. I haven't taken it out yet.
Oh.
I have to just very slightly a piece of text.
Okay.
And one of the examiners hopes I will publish it. I will think about that.
Okay.
So I still have to finish one or two technical requirements before the doctorate is conferred. But it's recommended by the examiners. So I'm in that kind of last stage.
I know that stage. But which university will you be defending?
At the Australian National University
in Canberra. Okay.
It was really founded as a postgraduate university.
Yeah.
And I felt I was approached years ago, or the question was raised, would I think about doing a doctorate? And through the faith of colleagues who had been patient for so many years, I felt bound to shut out other things and deliver this work. And it's been done.
And because you have such an amount of volume of information that you assemble and reflect, not only information, but reflection that you, and also the international perspectives. So it's fabulous. And especially for the younger generations to have, at the same time for you to kind of organize, because a PhD forces you to, really get organized and
definitely.
Yeah, and so it's going to be very good. I'm very much looking forward to seeing it and and let us know, because we will be now maybe it's even online on Zoom, the PhD defenses, who knows, with all these technologies. Yeah. Well, that's great. I didn't know that. It's fantastic. So I want to go back to the period of the creation of UMAC now, and you were VP, you were Vice President of ICOM at the time, and I want to share with you a beautiful photo that, in fact, I have it better here, which is the photo of the UMAC was created in this general conference, the 19th general conference in Barcelona of ICOM, and this was the board. Now it was called, now it's called executive board, but it used to be called the executive council, I think, that was elected there. And so perhaps to give us some idea who the people are. So there's the president, I know him, and that's Jack Perrault. And then I see you and Manus Brinkman, who's was not here he's not in this photo because he was the Director General at the time. A secretary was called.
Secretary General then.
Secretary General was called. But give us an overview of this board.
So you see me over at one side, and in the middle is Yanni Herreman, and who was the other vice president with me. There are always two vice presidents. So Yanni was the other vice president. Jacques Perrault, then directing, I think the museum, the National Museum at Compiègne.
Compiègne in France.
In France, was director for the second time.
Yes.
You see, going over to the left next to me, Martin Scherer, who was on the board for a long time. Then you see Giovanni Pina from
Italy.
Italy. Then you see, my very good friend from Sweden.
But we have here the names of everyone.
And I know her so well. I just didn't expect to see this photograph.
Yeah, well, it was sorry to trap you, but here we have. No, so we have Yanni, you mentioned, Bernice, we mentioned.
Yes.
Then we didn't go, there's Gary Edson, where is
Gary Edson is there at the back, yes, from...
Actually, the photo was taken from here, so it's even easier that we do it like here. So we have Jacques Perrault.
Yes.
We have Yanni Herman.
Yes.
Here. Then you have you. You look the same, by the way. You look absolutely the same. It's been 20 years. You look gorgeous, absolutely the same. And then we have Camila Gonzalez Go, and that's her, right? Camila? No?
No.
Okay, maybe she's not here. Maybe she's not here in this.
What?
Giovanni Pina. Elizabeth Hoff. Exactly.
Elizabeth Olofsson, who is head of staff and a very active contributor to ICOM.
Yeah, then Martin Scherer, we have him here.
Yes.
And then we have Alessandra Cummings, who...
Then you have Alessandra, who later became president. She's from Barbados.
Of ICOM. And we have here Pascal Makambila here.
From Congo.
Yeah, from Congo.
From the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we went through everyone more or less. Good. So this was the top administrators. So for those who don't know ICOM, this board is the board who has the authority, according to statutes, to create international committees.
It's a governing body.
Yes, the governing body that has the authority to create international committees. And UMAC, initially, before I talked to you, I thought that UMAC had only appeared, the first time it appeared in a document had been in a document that we have actually in our website. And that's this document that I'm going to share with you now. It's a document of October 2000. And this was, I thought, the earliest document, public at least, where UMAC was created. And it is called an update on international committees. And then it says these two new international committees were officially approved by the Executive Council at its June 2000 meeting. And in fact, I didn't know that this was created too. So it's kind of a twin brother of UMAC, the International Committee for Museums and Collections of Arms and Military History, and UMAC was created. And then you have a short description of the mission and objectives of each new international committee. However, when talking to you, I realized, in preparation of this conversation, I realized that, first of all, the proposal to create an international committee of university museums dates from much earlier, first thing. And then it comes in a context of a certain tension, if I could call it, forces between some conceptual clarity of ICOM to preserve, the specialized domains of expertise versus a fluidity of disciplines and of more flexibility and more internal connections between the committees. So when UMAC comes as a proposal, it comes right into this internal discussion of perhaps an eternal discussion, which probably today still goes on. So could you give us some clarity about this process and try to dissect it, kind of post-mortem thing, so that people who don't know how ICOM works, how was all this done, and timeline and so on?
So before I go into the specific answer to your question, Marta, I think it might be helpful to people first if I give a little bit of a sense of the history of ICOM. I don't mean a history lesson, but I mean a sense of ICOM changing quite markedly in the 1990s. In reflection, when ICOM began in '46, it was for some years a very small gathering of people by invitation only. And for quite some years, there were less than 100 members. In 1974, around that time, there were now, when the definition of museums that in a way has a legacy through to today was adopted. In '74, ICOM had about 800 members. In the period where I was involved as vice president through a whole reform movement of ICOM with a task force, ICOM was now around 15,000 members.
Incredible.
Talking about the 1990, the reform movement was from 1999 to 2000, and then all the reform proposals were adopted. And they all were, in fact, all 57 were adopted in 2001 in Barcelona.
Yeah.
And that dovetails with your sense of UMAC being created around that time or adopted slightly before, given permission to exist.
Yeah.
But if I can clarify a certain tension you alluded to, the tension was actually not about exclusivity. It was more an anxiety that if you created committees that overlap with other committees,
right,
you would create a tension between where ICOM members would most serve.
Of course.
And I first remember, I believe it was in '95, the discussion came up that there was a possibility or a proposal to ask the Executive Council to approve the formation of a committee for university museums. And I remember very clearly the discussion being quite agitated at council level. And it was not at all against universities. It was,
of course,
animated by a worry, but if they have now another organization for university museums, they won't go to ICME for ethnography. They won't go to CMAC for museums and whatnot. It was split up, the constituency.
You said, sorry to interrupt, but you mentioned 1995, or was it 1998? Okay, I thought, okay.
Well, no, my memory is that it was first crossing the council agenda of discussions in '95.
Right.
But by 1998 and '9, when there was a whole reform movement underway, and in 1999, I remember I was elected as vice president in '98. In 1999, the council asked me, would I chair a reform task force?
Yes.
For reconsidering the whole of ICOM's functioning. And so the council referred that issue of not only university museums, whether that would be created or not, but the whole issue of committees was referred to the task force.
Right. In a broader discussion of committees, the function of committees, operation, and so on.
Exactly.
Do you know whom? Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
So that's how it came into consideration through the reform movement.
Right.
And I was much involved in developing a report that developed, it was called the Toolbox Report because it came out of the ICOM Reform Task Force. And the idea, certainly in my mind, was not to generate a report that sort of goes dead as such official documents do, but to create a toolbox.
Yes.
So I very much hope we would create a set of tools that enable people from whatever part of ICOM that they were most involved with to enter from that tool pathway and begin to learn more about the whole of ICOM's function.
Right. And in that document that you allowed me access earlier, I realized that you say, in fact, you argue that if the discussion of international committees is, if international committees are reformed, then the fears of those who opposed UMAC, the creation of UMAC, are unfounded, because there would be more stimulation, more fluidity, more flexibility, more dynamics, internal dynamics between the committees of expertise, and that would, make disappear the fears of other committees, especially the small ones, who would necessarily, or were afraid at least, to lose members, right?
Let me give you a response to this question, Marta, which opens up a way of working that I've developed over many years, certainly working with ICOM, which is to examine when people assert something. Let us create a new committee, and someone might assert, oh, but that would be problematic. I always believe it's valuable to try and look behind assertions and examine what is the context,
right?
What is the history, what obligations are there in this situation. And I found very much in chairing the whole reform task force, it was important not to begin formulating any reforms whatsoever, but first to ask questions. What are the governing documents of ICOM? What is its history? What do these documents say?
Right.
What obligations are there? And I found, for example, when I first chaired the task force, some people said, oh, well, you will have to rewrite the statutes in order to reform anything. And I took only one ex cathedra decision on my own, in other words, in the whole process. And I actually read the statutes for a whole weekend and learned
absolutely
how complex they are.
Yeah.
But I came when I met with the Reform Task Force and said, look, the one thing I most strongly feel is we're not going to touch the statutes, because we will spend the next couple of years on legalistic questions.
Couple of years. Couple of decades, maybe, at the speed of...
It's taken until 2016.
Yeah.
They were finally reformed and adopted in Milan.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing I outlined to my colleagues is that, in fact, that the statutes were not the problem at all.
Right.
In fact, a great deal of liberty was permitted to change and act differently already.
Right.
And in fact, that if we took those questions to heart and consulted with members' desires for change and thought how we could enable those, and also understood something of the history of ICOM, which was essential, we in fact could get on with a huge amount of work, which we did.
Of course.
And we came up with 57 reform proposals after 2 years.
Unanimously approved, right?
And it was approved. But if I can come back to UMAC and this attitude I was trying to describe, there was a kind of assumption that all of the committees that had been formed in a very logical, carefully sifting way.
Taxonomic.
Exactly. And by going back into the history and actually analyzing the committees that existed, I found they were full of inconsistencies. And so the first thing was to examine the present situation, find out what its patterns are, see what opportunity for change was there. And I finally came up with a proposition to my colleagues and then eventually to the council, which was, is the importance of ICOM to be I'm just going to try and click off a sound there. Whoops.
It's okay.
Sorry, Marta.
It's all right.
It seemed to me that there were inconsistencies in the way committees had been formed, and also once in, they were not examined as to how they were functioning. I found there was one committee of which nobody could give me a report that it was still functioning in the last 5 or more years. So I was able to point out to the task force and eventually lead this discussion through to council that there has been not a pattern of consistency. And really the question was the council there to be a gatekeeper or a midwife? Was the council there to enable opportunities, desires to find their form and for people to get on with work instead of thinking of gatekeeper questions of should we allow this? And in fact, I found this so often by resorting to analysis and giving people a history and then bringing a recommendation that the objections just dissolved.
Yeah.
And it finally was never a contentious issue. UMAC was formed.
Yeah.
So there should be no feeling that UMAC was formed against strong objection. In the end, the case argued itself. ICOM should be a midwife where there was a clear need. UMAC came into existence, and a long and glorious history.
Yeah, yeah. And it's actually very interesting because for university museums and collections abroad, this recognition and I suppose I was not in the very early stages of it, but from what I understood later, and also from discussions with the first board, and from these discussions that we're having also now, I understand that it was a priority to tell university administrations at that time that the museum sector, the cultural sector, recognized university museums, because the 1990s had been a terrible, well, all this still needs to be more systematized and researched, but there had been a decline in use of, for reasons that we're not going to discuss now, many university museums were shut down and closed. There were papers called The Crisis of University Museums. There was a conference in Glasgow called The Death of University Museums, all prehistory, but very, the conference in Glasgow was, I think, September 2000. So all this was happening at the same time, which brings me to so it was very important for the recognition. It was more than helping us out or assistance, although that was too, but it was very important because I think that looking back, that was the main turning point, was being able, breakthrough, being able to go back to each university and say, look, ICOM, headquarters in Paris, UNESCO affiliated and so on, recognizes this as a distinct group that has its distinct issues, its specific needs, and that was absolutely important, and brings me to the second reason why I think your contribution and your testimony is very important, which is the role of Australia, and because ICOM had in this creation of UMAC. It's the second point I wanted to address with you. ICOM had a general conference in 1998 in Melbourne. So that was one thing. Then Australia also was the first country, as far as I know, to do a survey of its university collections and museums nationally. So the Cinderella collections and then the Transforming Cinderella collections, which were published in the 1990s. Then you had also CALMAC, okay? The National Association, one of the earliest national network, I would call, of university museums in Australia, was created as a branch of Museums Australia in 1992. Then we had our first chair was Peter Stanley, an Australian, okay, and very much involved and engaged also in this international. So, of course, we know the issues were the same everywhere, and the UK also did surveys. The Netherlands also did surveys of its university heritage. But in your view, was there a cultural, a museological, a political context, both from the side of the museum sector and from the side of higher education, that propelled, I don't know if this word exists, okay, that, you know, made it possible for this, for Australia to be such a key player in the, at the beginning, and continues to be, but at the beginning, in the early global university museum movement? What is your view about this?
So, of course, I knew Peter Stanley well. And of course, from my Australian experience, I completely supported all the moves to organize, to gather a consensus, bring together the university sector, and to publish what was called the Cinderella Collections Report, which incidentally was launched at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, by the way. So I just put in context that I was wholly involved in a situation in Australia which was activist, determined, and moving, on the move. But I give this as a way of distinguishing between your personal experience and then how you get things steered through in ICOM. And I've always found it important to be able to take a wider view and handle a discussion. Again, history is very important. I have almost never in my involvement in ICOM taken a view that I had very strongly formed in Australia and simply reproduced it as an exhortation that ICOM should follow. For example, I've been involved in Indigenous activism and museums for as long as I've been involved in museums. Going back to my first heading of education and meeting one of our great Indigenous elders and having the privilege of being educated by him the moment I came to Sydney and into that job I described. So while I've personally been involved in activism about colonialism, Indigenous issues, and so on, right through my museum life, I always found it necessary to take a step back and remember that in ICOM, you are talking with representatives from the whole world, and you have to give the respect to dialogues needing time and needing many perspectives in order to get consensus. But I have never doubted the opportunity and the need to achieve change, never. It's how you achieve it that really matters. So you asked about the Australian context. Australian museums, before any governmental legislation came up, as it did in the United States, the NAGPRA legislation in 1990, rather forced museums to change their recognition of the relationship to Native communities and cultural material held. Museums in Australia, because we live so close to the impact of colonialism and museums as instruments of that colonialism, moved years before, and by 1991 had achieved a whole policy called Previous Possessions, New Obligations. So not things you might do when you think this is a good idea, obligations. There was a complete consensus position against any more collection of human remains, ancestral remains.
Of which there are many, or there were many, still are many in universities. So that brings higher education into the equation, right?
That's right. And to the credit of people like Peter Stanley and our university museum colleagues, they were drawn into these issues very actively for those very reasons. They knew of material in laboratories. They knew how indigenous remains and cultural heritage and sacred material had been treated. So in a way, these issues were all in ferment in Australia, and they were leading towards a policy where museums themselves created a determined position and said, not only no more, but it is our obligation to deaccession and remove where we can any ancestral remains. But this, of course, requires not just removal, but provenancing, consultation. It can be as traumatic to deaccession and remove material,
of course,
and think you're giving it back to the right community. That can arouse the very trauma that is almost equal to the violence of what happened originally. So our university museums were right across these questions. And if I can just segue quickly through, you mentioned the conference in Australia when Australia decided to bid for in 95, and actually they'd started bidding earlier and I became involved. That was how I got drawn into ICOM, actually. Because my colleagues asked me to become involved. But when Australia did hold the General Conference in 98, the theme was museums and cultural diversity. Now we've been working on that for a decade or more. So to answer your question, yes, Marta, I would not claim virtues for Australia, but only to say that in a society where the issues of colonialism were so upfront and close to questions of continuing injustice, continuing dispossession, we and New Zealand and the United States and Canada, that's why these four countries all had to be on the move about these historical injustices.
And in a way, the theme, that brings this wonderful answer. And I understand myself a little bit better the context for the Cinderella collections and the surveys, and understanding what universities had, oftentimes hidden or at least out of the radar of everyone. And it was important to bring all that into the discussion because universities, due to their research and teaching past, they were absolutely full, and they are, of scientific expeditions, collecting human remains, tissues, and so on. And so that was very important to bring them. And I understand this activism thing, the need for change, and how that, engulfed the university museums and collections in a good way, because they were recognized by the Museum Australia Association. So before ICOM recognized the UMAC as a global network, the COMAC was recognized. Yes, COMAC was recognized. The importance of university collections was recognized by the largest museum association in Australia. So I find that very important. I was curious if during the 1998 Melbourne, was there any specific discussion in the broader public, or like a workshop, or I suppose I could go and see the program. I didn't do that yet, but do you remember having any discussions about university already directing towards the creation in ICOM of a committee?
No, I would say simply, as you have raised, and I would affirm again, our university museums were on the move already.
Yeah.
So they met at the time they would have gathered with the whole ICOM gathering of the clans.
Right.
I would just add that the organization in Australia was so determined to have an impact through this conference that we had one of our today greatest and now elder activists, Marcia Langton, who is a professor at Melbourne University, speaking, and she gave a tremendously powerful denouncing address, I have to say. She did not spare museums.
Wow.
But we organized that she be given the platform. And a wonderful politician, one man who really embraced the indigenous cause from way over in the West, spoke also, and he remained a political leader for indigenous activism.
A reference.
Right through.
It's a reference today. Yeah, still today is a reference, and because the debate is really now, getting. It never stopped being, but now is pre-COVID. Is now there's the COVID thing, which kind of dominates all the conversations, but it's one of the most important debates of our time, and. UMAC has Steph Scholten, who is one of vice chairs of UMAC he's from the Netherlands, but currently the director of the Hunterian at the University of Glasgow. He has proposed a special project to ICOM, which has been funded to address issues of still the same kind of repatriation issues and ethics issues in university, still pending from these discussions that we're having. And we were supposed to go to Australia now in 2020 and sort of close the circle in that discussion. Well, close not the discussion, but go full circle. And it would be interesting. Maybe later I think you will contact you to have a broader historical overview, especially because you're addressing this in your thesis, so you have your fresh. But I would recommend to our viewers, because your introduction here is absolutely marvelous and gives all the context for the creation of ICOM, how the Code of Ethics was created, the context for it, the activism, the social, the passing to museum at the service of society with the 1972 document of Santiago and so on. So it's marvelous document for the history of museums and the history of ICOM, which mirrors the history of museums. But which brings us to, and I'm mindful of your time, and so which brings us to another part, the final part of our conversation, which is more general about museums. So I would like to ask you two things. I would like to ask you, what do you think are the most important challenges that the new challenges, because the challenges are enormous. And apart from COVID, what are the new challenges that museums face in the contemporary society? No, not new, just put everything in historical context, because I think that you do that very well.
I would be tempted, and people might expect me to say the Black Lives Matter Museum, of course. But again, the way I've learned to work most effectively with ICOM is not to jump straight at a prescriptive issue or a solution to a prescriptive issue, but to put things back into a state of reflection out of which you bring a more informed kind of activism.
Okay, but wait, hang on. Please clarify, what do you mean by the Black Lives Matter Museum?
So I was really going to say, I'm going to leave that for a moment, although it becomes utterly crucial. You asked me what I think the challenges are. I think for museums, one of the first I would say would be for museums to examine the fundamentals of their history, their existence, collections if they have them, other ways of behaving if they don't have collections, and really to look at the whole series of pathways of development along which they have traveled. Now that involves fundamentally a recognition of colonialism and how that is impacted across the entire constitution of museums, organization of museums, the way they have behaved, formed collections, defended those collections. And if you establish this kind of fundamentals framework, you will then come towards the other challenges, I think, in a more informed way. So a second major challenge apart from going back to fundamentals and examining the ethics of museums and all of the historical pathways, the second major challenge for now, I would say, is adaptability and responsiveness to all of the social movements, impulses crowding in around museums, and in many respects demanding change with a renewed energy. And that's when I would be attending to the Black Lives Matter movement. So what I'm trying to say is, compelling as all of this is, and all of the television footage that we have seen is, my suggestion is not simply to say, right, we have to act on that straight away. The first thing is to establish a framework,
right,
and a series of reflections through which you will take up those very challenges. And if you are thoughtful and searching in examining how have museums got to the position where they have excluded people, so that people have had to rise up in the streets about exclusion, and all of the kinds of devaluing of their histories and cultures that have formed the whole context of museums, you will approach those issues in a much more informed way than simply leaping to be a good citizen straight into the challenge. You have to see what lies behind the challenge. You understand even more powerfully the bitterness, the terrible historical experience that people have suffered through kinds of historical exclusion in which museums are complicit, right through.
Right.
The third challenge then, while addressing those issues, is utterly crucial for museums, adapting to the challenges of the present. A third issue that's come up now, I think, is building resilience. Imagining a world, and the COVID situation has forced this upon us all, a world where there are not so many museums claiming the resources they've claimed for the last 20, 30, 40 years. There are not so many museums being built. There is not an ever expansion of blockbuster exhibitions, because for all kinds of reasons they may not be possible. But I think there are much more compelling reasons to question how museums have come to rely on those kinds of draw cards to bring in audiences and evaluate success by numbers and attendance figures, instead of what is your social impact? How are you reaching the communities in which you are located? And ICOM, in the ethics work that I was involved with, moved the whole idea of community on into more specific categories. And through the ethics, the code of ethics that I was involved in reforming, which is probably up for reconsideration again today, an important movement was made there under Geoffrey Lewis to define constitutive communities where museums exist and how they've been constituted. Communities served, and this would come in very much to refer to museums, because community serves radiates right across the world globally, and university museums have often found that, or they did so until they reconsidered their position, they were serving an international intellectual community rather than the community where they were located. The local community. The local. But there's a third kind of community pivotally recognized in the ICOM Ethics Code of 2004, and that is communities of origin.
Right.
And that they have rights, and that they have rights that must be addressed. They cannot be dismissed or put to the side, as historically tended to happen. And this brings in the whole world of communities of origin, brings in all of the indigenous communities, native communities around the world, but other kinds of social communities have been excluded from museums historically. So when museums have this much more a kind of a much more searching and self-examining approach to the whole idea of communities and their history. They will not come through with sort of singular kinds of recommendations. They will always be searching for greater involvement of communities that have not been involved, or in the case of university museum, greater involvement of the campus community where you live.
And local communities.
And local communities, again, in the cities where university museums
and communities of origin also, because we continue to have. It's an excellent question and made me think about the differences between this reorientation of the museum towards the social inequalities and the social movements. So the opening up of museum towards society, the social movements, the social development, etc., in all its multiplicities. How is it different from the earlier open up of the museum in the late 1960s that led to the Declaration of Santiago and so on? How do you compare these two times in history where museums had to reorient themselves, or they have to reorient themselves towards more inclusion of excluded communities and so on, because we were talking about the same thing in 1970s, right?
Indeed.
So,
and in the
tell us your view about it.
So the 1970s, changes in museums come after May 68, after first of all, the activism that began in Paris and moved across Europe and moved all around the world. So the 1970s experienced in particular the upsurge of feminism, for example, and the whole debate about patriarchy that runs through the whole history of museums.
Right.
But there were still rather generic claims often made about education, about society,
right.
That did not allow for the excluded voices that were already coming through in the 1970s. For example, it's always fascinated me the way feminism, through its critique of patriarchy, opened the way to all kinds of excluded communities.
Right.
Of color, of colonial histories, of many kinds of exclusion, of gender. All of those excluded communities started to find a way through feminism to bring their particular senses of exclusion and the particular histories that they brought to bear on the arguments they made into a very clear public debate. I think feminism wasn't always clear about the nature of other kinds of exclusion, particularly in relation to Indigenous communities, for example. Right. In the early days of feminism, the assumption that an activist woman in an Indigenous community should leave her men and protest against them when the entire history of these communities was at such an extreme state of disadvantage. Right. There were some very interesting clashes at that time. But I'm really speaking to a process that has been ongoing, and coming through those decades you alluded to, Marta, we have experienced more kinds of analysis of social process, of how all kinds of coalitions of power form in human life, in human communities, and how there will always be tensions around governance, around codes, around rules of behavior. And to the degree that these play into the lives of museums, which they definitely do, we should expect that these debates, these tensions, these struggles will be ongoing. Yeah. And museums need resilience as well as attentiveness to be able to think how to take up all of these pressures upon them, because my last point is these pressures come through to a voiced condition through many particular histories of exclusion and through many particular inflections of diversity.
Right. Well, let's hope that we can find the space, the will. I think we want everyone to accommodate, and not only accommodate, to be factors for change too in society, right? So that's what I think is also common with the late 1960s, 70s. It's like museums were instrument of the development and the progress of society. So, and in that respect, I think the movement nowadays is very similar to that, is that museums can act, they should act in order to diminish inequalities, to bring voices that were never inside the elites.
And in a world of great change, look at the refugee crisis, the crisis of
migration,
populations on the move, away from traditional homelands,
water issues,
water
droughts,
resources, fear of food supplies running out, and the kind of appalling civic competition for resources that could create rebellions over food, for example, and water.
Yeah, it's an incredible agenda and incredible mandate. I mean, it's too much, obviously, for museums, and everyone needs to be contributing as within their sphere of knowledge and so on. And I think university museums actually do have a role to play, because being inside, where research is happening and providing awareness to society at the time where, at the same time, declining reason and science and knowledge is happening so much in the world everywhere. So I think that university museums really do have a role to play in this overwhelming agenda. Well, it's been a delight to talk to you. My mind is still, bubbling with all the information and knowledge and reflection that you provided. I will have to, listen to us one more time in order to process this, but it's been wonderful for the history of UMAC to clarify all the points. And I invite you and all viewers to follow this series, because there's going to be many more until next year at our annual conference in Dresden. And I hope to interview Peter Stanbury, the two first Manus Brinkman, unfortunately, he passed away, Manus Brinkman.
Yes, he did.
But I would like to interview more people
Could I say two more things, Marta?
Yeah, sure.
Just very quickly, in this world where truth is questioned daily, I think university museums have a number of utterly critical roles, given the intensive intellectual resources they command. Other museums command intellectual resources also, but universities sit inside the research laboratories of our evolving state of society and culture. They have a tremendous responsibility to keep pressing awareness of what is truthful, what is reliable information versus unreliable and falsified information. They have a huge responsibility to keep people aware of planetary threat and of how the entire system of nature and culture interacting as it has through history is in jeopardy. And they have a very important role to connect nature and culture, which university museums have a particular history in terms of the kinds of collections they have formed to carry forward. And I think the last thing, I have two, but there's one more. In a world where governance structures are breaking down, where trust in international systems of resolving conflict, of gathering more knowledge, of mediating difficult conversations where these issues are so fractious and abraded and
divisive.
divisive. University museums have such a role here to use their resources to try and build solidarity across these divisions.
Absolutely.
That's all.
Well, it's been great, wonderful, and when you talk, it gives me, you know, I want to say more things, but mindful of our viewers who are already
enough for one day.
Enough for one day, and there's so many discussions and so many questions I wanted to ask you, but I think that we should stop now. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have this wonderful conversation with you, Bernice. I'm a biggest fan, and thank you all for all watching on YouTube and live or later. And also thank you for the University of Lisbon for allowing me to use the Zoom platform. And I hope to see you, I think, in 2 weeks with another conversation about the history of UMAC and the memories of those who were at the center of its creation 20 years ago. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marta.
Oh no.